Whether it looks radically different or not, the 2023 Mercedes needs to be a significant improvement on its predecessor for the team to fight for Formula 1 titles again. The W13 was not a tremendous failure. It still won a race, still scored a pole, racked up 17 podium finishes and fought for second in the Constructors' Championship. But it was fundamentally flawed, and Mercedes spent the second half of last year knowing it would have to wait until the winter to iron out the baked-in problems of its package. Mercedes put a huge amount of work into understanding why it misjudged the new technical rules last year and getting to the core of the 2022 car's problems, peeling back the onion layer by layer and improving the tools it had at its disposal to address the underlying issues. If that has worked as Mercedes hopes, there are several areas the 2023 package should perform better. Before we explain what they are though, we want to let you know about this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network that keeps you safe when you're on the internet and hides your location. So whether you're at home or abroad, you can change your virtual location to get around any geo-blocking restrictions or to access more shows from your favourite streaming services. If you want to watch content online, whether it's motorsport related or anything else, then a VPN will give you as much choice as possible by giving you access to TV shows and films that aren't otherwise available in your country. Surfshark VPN also protects you when you're out and about and using public Wi-Fi, which is a goldmine for hackers. But Surfshark VPN encrypts your online data and protects your personal information, giving you more security online. So what are you waiting for? Get Surfshark VPN using promo code THERACE for 83% off and an extra 3 months for free. That's promo code THERACE at the link in the description below. Mercedes will have prepared a big to-do list for the W14, and there are doubtless going to be priority items that it never even mentioned to the outside world before disappearing for the winter. But we know from the weaknesses Mercedes did highlight on the W13 that some core design areas require focus, beyond the obvious suggestion that they need to make sure there is no porpoising. Once Mercedes was able to contain the worst of the porpoising phenomenon in the first quarter of 2022, other weaknesses were rapidly exposed. Back-to-back races on street tracks in Monaco and Azerbaijan were ruthless in highlighting its mechanical deficiencies. The porpoising was exaggerated by the stiffness of the car. Where the W14 needs to be better basically comes down to being able to run it lower, with a mix of specific requirements relating to suspension travel and ride height. The W13 had to run higher than ideal because of the mix of whatever aerodynamic stalls the car was suffering from at its intended ride height, and the stiffness that meant bouncing against the track surface was so aggressive. Mercedes had to increase the ride height at certain circuits, and with limited suspension travel, it also had to run the car very stiffly to prevent it dropping at speed. If the W14 has better overall ride quality and the aerodynamic bouncing remains contained, then it will run lower than the W13 did and its performance will be better. Basically, it just needs to be run in a condition that's achievable in the real world. In terms of surface aerodynamics, Mercedes is probably going to persevere with its narrow sidepod design on the W14 because it stressed several times last year that this was not the root of the W13's problems. One specific problem it did cause was related to the stiffness of the floor. Essentially, with more of the floor edge exposed, maintaining rigidity was tough, and with the ground effect rules, a floor that's less stiff will amplify any porpoising. This was a bigger concern for Mercedes in the first half of the year, and it was able to stiffen the floor, but that came with added weight, so striking a better balance will be important on the 2023 car. Mercedes suffered from too much drag throughout 2022. In fact, Lewis Hamilton put it at number 2 or equal number 1 on the things that Mercedes needs to fix for the W14. This was most likely caused by the compromises Mercedes had to make to deal with its core problems, raising the ride height to avoid bouncing and then picking a bigger rear wing than it would have ideally used to give it the downforce that the increased ride height had sacrificed. Technical director Mike Elliott suggested there was evidence of that in Mexico, where drag was less of a penalty and the cars were all running maximum downforce, as Mercedes was as competitive as any team with the exception of the particularly low drag Red Bull. While there may have been an element of the car not being as aerodynamically efficient as it could be, solving the other issue should naturally bring Mercedes a good amount of drag reduction. Whatever the root cause, it must be addressed, as team boss Toto Wolff reckoned in the worst cases it cost Mercedes 6 tenths on the straights. There was another knock-on effect from its early 2022 problems that point to some low-hanging fruit with the W14, car weight. Like almost every team on the grid, Mercedes battled to get its car close to the weight limit in 2022, a combination of just how heavy the cars are in general and specific issues, like having such a big area of exposed floor that it had to be heavier to resist the flexing. With the cliche 10 kilos is worth 3 temps in mind, weight reduction is easy lap time if you can achieve it, so Mercedes could have prioritised this in season. But Mercedes had bigger development items to pursue, especially in the first half of the year, so in Elliott's words, it didn't really go after the weight. Although there were some opportunities to make gains with update packages later in the year, it was always going to be more of a winter focus. Mercedes wouldn't disclose the weight of the W13 by the end of the season, but the W14 needs to be on or as close to the limit as possible this year, a task complicated slightly by the fact the limit actually reduces by 2 kilograms. There are other items that Mercedes could do with improving from 2022, although these are lower priorities. One that you may be less familiar with is what drivers often refer to as brake separation or a split in the brakes. This is when there is a temperature imbalance between the brakes on the right and the left, and was an issue that Hamilton talked about frequently in 2022. It tends to cause lockups on outlaps, but that can be got under control by working the brakes. But while that can be managed preparing for a qualifying run, it's not much good fresh out of the pits in a race or after a safety car. We've also heard Mercedes talk a little bit about an engine deficit it felt it had in 2022, which was worked on through the year but will undoubtedly be an area of focus. Though Mercedes no longer seemed to be the benchmark, the actual deficit was only around a tenth or so. Even though the engine specifications are frozen in terms of performance updates, it's still possible to eke a bit more out of the power units through software tweaks and reliability improvements that allow the engines to be run harder. A final area worth flagging potentially brings us full circle. There was a trend through the season of the Mercedes sometimes struggling with tyre warm-up in qualifying. Elliott suggested that the underlying car concept, and no, we don't mean the side pods, exaggerated its issues over a single lap. So there is reason to believe that this would improve with a better balanced car in general, because there'll be a wider window for everything to work as it should. This is probably all Mercedes will focus on in this regard, because the warm-up trait is something Mercedes has accepted as a trade-off for a long time, given the benefit it usually has in making it stronger in race stints. Mercedes is therefore not minded to give up race performance for qualifying performance, but as Elliott said, we've got a menu of things we want to do over the winter that will help both. Whether we know all the items on that menu or not, how much of it Mercedes has managed to achieve will determine whether it's straight back into title contention this year.